In 2012, a team of archaeologists in Music Leicester, England, made a discovery so bizarre it barely seemed real. They were not expecting to find much. The dig had been organized to locate the remains of a medieval church, Greyfriars Fry, which music historical records suggested had once stood somewhere beneath the modern city center. The team had permission to excavate a small area of a council car park. They brought their tools. They marked out their trenches. Music began to dig through layers of tarmac, rubble, and centuries of compacted earth. On the very first day of the excavation, they found a skeleton. And not just any skeleton. The bones they pulled from that ground belonged to a king, a warrior, a man who had been dead for 527 years and whose reputation had been dragged through the mud for almost every one of them. A man whose story had been written by his enemies, performed on the stages of Shakespeare's theaters, and taught in every history classroom in the English-speaking world for generations. Richard III, the last Plantagenet, king, the final warrior monarch of medieval England, the man Tudor propaganda turned into the most famous villain in music British history. But when scientists took those bones into a laboratory, music, and extracted the DNA locked inside them, they did not just confirm the identity of a long-dead king. They cracked open a secret that had been buried for even longer than the skeleton itself. A secret that reaches back to the very foundations of the English monarchy. A secret that raises a question nobody in power has ever wanted to answer. Was the English crown ever truly legitimate at all? Stay with us, because once you hear what the DNA found, you will never look at British history the same way again. Before we get to the bombshell, you need to understand what scientists were actually looking for when they tested these bones, because the science is what makes this story impossible to dismiss. When forensic music geneticists work with ancient remains, they focus on two very specific music types of DNA. Each one tells a completely different story. And in the case of Richard III, each one produced a result that nobody in that laboratory was prepared for. The first type is mitochondrial DNA. This is genetic material that lives not in the cell nucleus, music, but in tiny structures called mitochondria found throughout the cell. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down exclusively through the maternal line from mother to all of her children, but only daughters can pass T onto the music next generation. This creates an unbroken maternal thread stretching back through music thousands of years. It does not mix with paternal DNA. Music. It does not recombine. It changes extraordinarily slowly, accumulating tiny mutations across thousands of years rather than generations. This makes it one of the most stable and reliable tools, music, in all of forensic science. Think of mitochondrial DNA as a biological surname that passes only through mothers. If you can find two people who share the same maternal ancestor, no matter how many centuries separate them, their mitochondrial DNA should match. The second type is the Y chromosome. This works in the opposite direction entirely. Music. It is passed down exclusively through the male line from father to son, generation after generation, music without interruption. Every man in a direct paternal lineage should carry an identical or near identical Y chromosome to every other man in that same Utiskin music line. A son inherits his father's Y chromosome. His son inherits it, music from him. And so on down through centuries, the male genetic thread remains consistent and traceable. Together, these two types of DNA gave the Leicester research team a way to check two completely separate family trees against the same skeleton, the maternal line and the paternal line, and what they found in each case would tell two very different stories. Music. Finding the right living relatives was itself a years-long detective operation. Dr. T. King at the University of Leicester, music, led the genetic analysis. Professor Kevin Schurer led the genealogical research. Together, their teams combed through centuries of historical documents, medieval wills, parish records, marriage certificates, birth registers, royal chronicles, constructing family trees that stretched from the 15th century to the present day, with documentary evidence at music every single step. For the mitochondrial DNA test, music they needed living individuals who descended from Richard III's maternal line, specifically from his sisters or their female descendants. Music, through an unbroken chain of mothers and daughters all the way to the present day. They found two. Michael Ibsen was a Canadian furniture maker living in London. Through a chain of female ancestors spanning 17 generations, music, he was a descendant of Anne of York, Richard III's eldest sister. Wendy Dulig was living in Australia, also descended from Anne of York through a completely separate branch of the same maternal music line. The two of them had never met. They were 14th cousins twice removed. And yet, when their mitochondrial DNA was tested, they matched each other perfectly, confirming that the family tree connecting them was accurate. Music. And then they both matched the Leicester skeleton. The probability of the bones being those of King Richard III was calculated at 99.9999%. The oldest forensic cold case in British history was officially closed after 529 years. But the mitochondrial result was only half the story, and the second half was about to detonate like a grenade beneath 5 centuries of official history. For the Y, chromosome analysis, the researchers needed men who descended from the Plantagenet royal house through an unbroken paternal line. Because Richard III himself left no known living descendants, the team traced the male line forward music through his extended family, specifically through Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort, who claimed Plantagenet music descent through John Beaufort, the son of John of Gaunt, who was himself the son of Edward III. This was a direct and documented father-to-chain, stretching from one of England's greatest medieval kings all the way to 5 living men in the present day. If the genealogical record was accurate, if every father in that chain was biologically the father history said he was, music, their Y chromosomes, should match the skeleton. They did not match, not even close. The Y chromosome of Richard III was a completely different genetic profile from the Y chromosomes of the Somerset descendants. Somewhere along that paternal line across music, those centuries of documented father to inheritance, the biological reality and the official record had silently come apart. A child who had been recorded as the legitimate son of his music father was in biological fact the son of someone else entirely. In scientific language, this is called a false paternity music event. In plain language, there was a secret in the royal bloodline. Someone had an affair. A child was born outside the official relationship. Music, but registered as legitimate. And that secret had been successfully kept through coronations and wars and executions, and music, the rise and fall of entire dynasties, for somewhere between 500 and 700 years until a DNA laboratory in Leicester found it. The researchers identified the most likely location of the break as somewhere between Edward III and the descendants of John of Gaunt or John Beaufort. And this is where the historical record becomes extraordinary music, because John of Gaunt had been the subject of illegitimacy rumors throughout his own lifetime. Edward III was frequently absent from court during the period when John was conceived. The whispers about his true parentage circulated widely enough among contemporaries to be taken seriously by those who knew the court. Music. They were dismissed publicly as enemy propaganda, as politically motivated slander, as the kind of rumor that powerful men always attracted in dangerous times. The DNA suggests those rumors contained music truth. And here's why that matters. On a scale that goes far beyond the personal story of one medieval nobleman, John of Gaunt was the father of Henry Bolingbroke, the man who overthrew Richard II, music, and crowned himself Henry IV, founding the Lancastrian dynasty. John of Gaunt was the great-great-grandfather of Henry VIII. He was the direct patrilineal ancestor through whom the entire Tudor dynasty traced its claim to the throne of England. If John, music of Gaunt, was not the biological son of Edward III, he carried no true Plantagenet blood in his Y chromosome. And if that is true, then Henry IV's claim to the throne, the claim that launched the Lancastrian dynasty, ignited the Wars of the Roses, and eventually produced the Tudor monarchs, was built on a biological foundation that did not exist. Henry V, Henry VI, Henry the Weaneth, Henry VIII, Edward Music, Sixth, Mary the Elizabeth Rimers, 7 monarchs over a century of English history, the Reformation, the dissolution of the monasteries, the Spanish Armada, the beheading of Anne Boleyn. Every one of these defining moments in British history unfolded under the authority of a crown whose legitimacy music traced back through the male line to its very source. The DNA now places in serious question 500 years of English monarchy, potentially built on a bloodline that was never what it claimed to be. While the Y chromosome was dismantling the political foundations of the crown, another section of the genetic analysis was doing something far more intimate. It was reconstructing what Richard III actually looked like. For centuries, historians, music, and portrait painters had depicted Richard in largely consistent terms. Dark-haired, dark-eyed, music, a somber and brooding figure whose shadowed appearance reflected the villainous character that Tudor propaganda had so effectively constructed around him. Shakespeare's Richard was a man consumed by music, physical deformity, and psychological darkness, a creature whose twisted body reflected his corrupted soul. The portraits nodded to the same narrative. This was a man who looked like what Tudor England needed him to be, and the DNA said something completely different. The geneticist markers extracted from the Leicester skeleton predicted blue eyes and a significant probability of blonde or light brown hair, at least in childhood, likely darkening with age. Not the dark and sinister figure of historical imagination. A man who may have looked far more like the golden Plantagenet warrior kings who came before him than the Tudor. Monster mythology ever allowed? It is a detail that sits alongside the political earthquake music or the Y chromosome findings. But it is an important reminder of how history actually works. The winners do not just write the story, music. They paint it. They commission the portraits. They perform the plays. They control the image until the image becomes music, the truth. And the truth becomes impossible to see behind the propaganda. The DNA does not care about any of that. It just tells you what was actually there. In 2015, 3 years after his bones were pulled from beneath a Leicester car park, Richard III was rearied at Leicester Cathedral with full royal ceremony. Thousands of people lined the streets of the city. A procession carried his coffin through Leicester, giving him the dignified departure he had been denied, music, 5 centuries earlier. Senior members of the royal family attended. The service was broadcast nationally across Britain. It was an act of historical music correction, a recognition that the man beneath the tarmac had been music wronged by history, by propaganda, by the enemies who buried him without ceremony, and then spent music, a generation turning him into a monster. And there is something quietly extraordinary about that moment, because the same DNA that gave Richard III back his name and his dignity, that confirmed beyond all reasonable doubt that the bones in that car park were his, was the very same day that undermined the legitimacy of every monarch who had benefited from his destruction. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot use the science to honor the king and ignore the science when it inconveniences the music dynasty built on his grave. The bones are music his. The DNA confirms it. And the DNA also confirms that somewhere in the royal bloodline, music long before Richard ever drew breath, a secret was kept that quietly changed music. The course of English history forever. A child was born outside the official record, placed on the family tree of kings and used as the biological foundation of a dynasty that ruled England, music, for over a century. Nobody knew, or perhaps somebody, music did. Know, and the knowing died with them, buried under the weight of everything, music, that followed. Either way, it took a car park, a set of ancient bones, and a DNA laboratory to finally bring it into the light. This is what we do on Past Decoded. Every single week, we take the genetic evidence that mainstream history would prefer music to leave undisturbed, and we use it to tell the real story of who we are, where we came from, and what was buried long before any of us were born. If this video changed the way you see British history, subscribe to Past Decoded, and join us for a new decoded story every week. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the English crown was ever truly legitimate? And does it matter now? We will see you in the next one.